I remember about 20 years ago reading Stephen Levy's book Insanely Great, which phrase, by the way, must surely rank as one of Steve Jobs' more arrogant, not to say inelegant, hyperboles. One thing that sticks in my mind is the description of warring factions on the Macintosh development team arguing over whether Mac Write users ought to be allowed to move the text cursor using the keyboard. Purists argued that in a mouse-driven graphical user interface, the only elegant way to move the cursor was using the mouse, but the pragmatists pointed out that this required you to remove one hand from the keyboard, thereby blatantly interrupting the workflow. We all know who won. Today's Macs have arrow keys, and most applications that require text editing support all the same keyboard shortcuts as their Windows equivalent programs. Oddly enough, 30 years on, the same battle's playing out all over again on the iOS devices. Now, in using my iPad, there are lots of situations where I'm required to enter and edit text, mostly connected to things I'm doing in a web browser. And as a reasonably proficient computer user, the first thing I notice is the absence of arrow keys, not just for moving the cursor, but for selecting and cutting and pasting. Now, what I'm talking about here are the standard combinations of the Control and Shift, that's Command and Shift on a Mac with the arrow keys for cutting, pasting and selecting. And if you don't use these routinely, you won't get it. Something as simple as moving the cursor to amend a search string now becomes much more of a chore than it needs to be, because the only way to do it is to touch the screen at the point where you want the cursor to be. The problem with this is immediately obvious when you try it, especially if, like me, you use an iPad mini. God only knows what it's like on an iPhone. There's an inescapable design constraint at work here, which is that we're expected to manipulate directly with our fingers something that's built on a different scale to our fingers. And it's a problem. It's kind of like trying to pick your nose with a sausage. Just zoom in, the purists will say, and of course this does work, but it's the modern equivalent of reaching for the mouse, and in practice it's a pain. Now, Apple has provided various bits of trickery to get around this problem, but what it hasn't done is provided the obvious solution, which is a set of arrow keys on the keyboard and all the keyboard shortcuts that we're already familiar with. What we get instead are a pop-up magnifying glass and various draggable selection boxes with little handles which are still too small to grab. Now, I'm not knocking this, it's all very ingenious and probably quite useful for casual or inexperienced users because it's all more or less discoverable in user interface jargon, but it's not as good as the old-fashioned way, using the keyboard. And because iOS is such a closed platform, we're not allowed third-party innovations to help us out, like we are on the Android tablets. And if you still doubt the demand for such innovation, just check out the Google Play App Store, and you'll find tens or even hundreds of alternative keyboards on offer. But for now, on the iPad, it seems like we're stuck with sausages.